Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on quite a journey. We're looking into the history of Latvia. It's a country shaped really by its position right there on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. We've got a stack of sources here. The main one is A Brief History of Latvia by Associate Professor Dr. Afizavad Chayapolfat Sirivadanawarvachara, plus some related articles. Our mission really is to dig into these, pull out the key insights, and help you understand Latvia's story, especially its, remarkable endurance through centuries of change.
It really is a story tied so deeply to its geography, isn't it? And the influence of these powerful neighbors and, well, the persistent efforts of its people to just maintain their identity against some tremendous odds. We'll start with the ancient land, the earliest people, and then sort of trace the major shifts in power, rule, culture, all the way up to today.
Okay, let's dive in then, right? Let's start at the very, very beginning, the land itself. Before nations, before even distinct peoples, what's the geography like? What do the sources say?
Well, the source places Latvia in northeastern Europe, eastern Baltic shore. It's about 64,588 square kilometers. Borders Lithuania, Estonia, Russia, Belarus, and nearly 500 kilometers of Baltic coastline. But what's really fascinating is the age. The land itself formed 500 million years ago. The current shape, though, that emerged much later, maybe 10,000 years ago as the glaciers retreated. Melting ice, lake basins forming, highlands, valleys, lowlands. The Great Sarmatian feature gets a mention, too.
Wow, 500 million years. That's deep time. So people arrived relatively recently on that scale.
Exactly. The sources point to habitation starting in the final Paleolithic period, so maybe 11,000 to 8,000 years ago. We know this from archaeology. Finds like the bronze cellars, they're 7,000 to 9,000 years old themselves. Plus, flint tools, weapons, Stone Age bits and pieces found at places like Bauska, Riga. These early folks were likely drawn by resources,
Right.
Reindeer, plenty of fresh water, rivers, ravines for shelter.
Okay, so early hunters, basically, following the resources. What changes led to more settled life and these different tribes emerging?
Right, so by about 8,000 BC, conditions shift. They become more favorable for agriculture to start developing. Then fast forward to the end of the 5th millennium BC, the Neolithic, people really start settling permanently. This leads to what the source calls a ceramic culture. Still semi-sedentary, mind you. Fishing, gathering, trade, but also primitive farming. We even have woodcutting evidence from 2000 BC on the Gulf of Riga shore. And bronze use pops up by the 1st millennium BC. And the burial mounds. Thousands of them. With pots, tools, bronze, iron jewelry, it really points to a more settled life. And it's around the 2nd century AD that we see these distinct tribes appearing. The population diversifies. You've got the Balts, Latgalians, Selonians, Curonians, Semigallians, Prussians, Latvians, Lithuanians. And the Finno-Ugric tribes, especially the Livs and Sums, Balts tended to be around the Daugava Basin, west coast. Finno-Ugric tribes more in the east and north.
Right, and this is where language and culture really start to diverge.
Precisely. By the end of the 1st millennium AD, these differences are pretty solid. The Balts looked more south, southeast, focused on metal production, food production from farming. The Finno-Ugric tribes, like the Livs, they were more sea-oriented. Fishing, hunting, gathering were bigger for them. Their houses, construction styles differed. Though, interestingly, ornamentation, burial practices, has some similarities there. The Livs, for example, settled pretty extensively around the Gulf of Riga, spoke a Finnic language related to Finnish. Many eventually assimilated with Latvians, but they left a mark. The source notes this detail. The Livs had this incredibly rich vocabulary just for rain. No sounds shared with other languages. That tells you something about their connection to nature.
That is fascinating.
And kind of surprisingly, the great folklore narrators in Latvian tradition, even in the epic like Chushos, identified as Livs. Oh, and the first written record mentioning Latvian lands, it actually comes from an international law court in Vienna, so early connections beyond the immediate area.
Okay, so we have these established tribes rooted in the land. What happens when new forces arrive from outside the region?
That brings us to the Middle Ages. For Latvia, this really kicks off with a major shift in the 12th century. The Catholic Church is expanding, sees the Baltic as, unchristianized territory ripe for subjugation. Archbishops in Hamburg and Bremen saw economic opportunity too, not just a mission. And Pope Alexander III starts urging Christian rulers, Denmark, Teutons, Danes, Swedes, even England and France, to Christianize the local heathen Finns and pagans.
Sounds less like gentle conversion and more like a justification for conquest.
The sources are pretty clear on that. It quickly turns into armed struggle. Crusading knights got papal backing, even permission to pillage parts of Eastern Europe. But the local tribes didn't just roll over. They resisted, formed alliances, even got help from Vladimir of Kiev, who sent mercenaries in 1147. The German Crusades, though, Those were really impactful. Late 12th to 14th centuries, you had military orders like the Teutonic Knights, they'd been in the Holy Land, then settled in Prussia after a crusade there. And Bishop Albert of Bremen founded the Livonian bishopric in 1201. He was a key player in the Baltic Crusades.
So who was actually doing the fighting and the administering on the ground?
It was a mix. You had the bishops wielding ecclesiastical power, and then the military orders like the Knights of the Sword, who later merged with the very powerful Teutonic Knights. They systematically conquered the local tribes: Livs, Salonians, Latgalians, Curonians, Semigallians. For Bishop Albert, maybe the mission was primary, but for the orders, the sources suggest it was definitely about money, war spoils, taxes, getting land. They took out the Livs first, then kept pushing against Lithuanians and Prussians.
How did this whole conquest period fundamentally change the region, set up future power dynamics?
Well, it carved up the land, divided it into fiefs, some controlled by bishops, others by the order, and merchants, especially in Riga. They started becoming really prominent. The Livonian Order, in particular, set up its own quite sophisticated administration. But here's a really crucial development. Riga joins the Hanseatic League in 1282.
Ah, the Hanseatic League, that huge trading network. What did that mean for Latvia?
It was massive. Joining the League pulled Riga, and by extension the surrounding lands, firmly out of the eastern sphere, culturally, economically, and into the west. Riga's location, right on that Daugava river bend, was perfect. It became this vital trade hub connecting Western Europe all the way to Novgorod in Russia. Goods flowed both ways: wax, fur, pelts, timber, fish, honey from the east, exchanged for wares from Germany, England, the Netherlands, Scandinavia. Now, this brought wealth, fueled town growth. You see impressive stone churches going up in Riga, but it also had a serious social downside. The sources really emphasized this. It cemented this stark division: German barons and powerful townsfolk versus the barons and peasants in the countryside, many of whom were Latvian. This created jealousy, resentment, hindered potential for centuries, the source argues.
Right, so the Hanseatic League pulls the region west, brings trade, but also deepens those social divisions.
Right.
How did that set the scene for the next big player?
Well, as power dynamics shifted, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became a major force in the 14th century, really rivaling the German influence. And when the Livonian Order finally fell apart in 1561, weakened by internal issues, external pressure, large parts of Latvia, Vidzeme, and Zemgal specifically, fell under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Okay, another major shift. What did that mean for administration and life there?
It meant a complete overhaul of local administration. The old Livonian masters lost authority. They were replaced by Polish royal officials, castellans they were called, and other officers. Polish nobles gained a lot of influence, acquired land, but the sources note the German nobility mostly stuck around.
Ah, so potential for conflict right there.
Exactly. Led to ongoing tension, and the Jesuit Catholic Church also expanded its activities, sometimes quite forcefully.
Were there noticeable cultural shifts under the Commonwealth?
Yeah, you see Polish folklore, mythology popping up in some areas. The Polish nobility certainly flourished. Administratively, the structure changed. And according to the sources, this period, at least initially, brought maybe a bit more political stability compared to the fragmented Livonian times, less civil unrest. However, boundary disputes were apparently common, sometimes led to actual conflict. It highlights this lack of clear territorial understanding, prompting calls for new maps.
And after the Commonwealth, who takes over?
That's when Sweden steps in. In 1629, this is during the 30 Years' War raging across Europe, Sweden gains control over significant parts of Latvia, the region of Livonia, after signing a peace treaty with Poland.
So, Swedish rule now. Another change in laws, culture.
Definitely. Swedish laws, the power structure of the Swedish nobility, all introduced into their territories. But this period under Swedish rule was also marked by quite a bit of hardship for the local population.
Hardship. Like,
The sources talk about devastating events. The plague, for instance, reportedly killed about a third of the population. Huge numbers in cities like Riga. Taxes were cranked up to really unsustainable levels, apparently comparable to Polish times. And the Swedish nobility, they had very high privileges. Exempt from government service, held extensive feudal rights over the peasants who really bore the economic brunt.
okay, so we've had the German orders, Polish Lithuania, now Sweden controlling parts of Latvia. Sweden was a major Baltic power, but not unchallenged. What happens next?
Right. The early 18th century brings the Great Northern War. Sweden controlled a lot of territory around the Baltic, but Russia, under Tsar Peter the Great, who desperately wanted Baltic access, Saxony and Poland all contested this. It was a brutal war fought all across the region. The sources detail the back-and-forth battles, troop movements. Ultimately, it led to Sweden's power really declining significantly by around 1715, 1717.
And the outcome for Latvia?
Russia came out on top in the east. And as a result of the war, the Russian Empire incorporated Latvia in 1721. They'd actually captured Riga back in 1710. This was huge for Russia, gave them that vital window to the west, through the Baltic Sea, the Neva River, crucial for imperial ambitions, trade.
So this starts nearly 2 centuries of Russian rule. What was that period like?
The sources point to major changes: economic, social, political. Economically, an extensive railway network was built, connected Latvia deep into Russia, but also to Western Europe. Unlocked resources, boosted trade, farms did well. Politically, though, it was the absolutist Tsarist regime. Very tight control. Any attempts by Latvians at self-governance were consistently limited. And this period saw the rise of what the source calls Great Russian Chauvinism, basically prioritizing Russian language, culture, administration.
Making it difficult for Latvian identity to flourish politically.
Exactly. Non-Russian national expression was seen as a threat. Political parties were eventually banned, workdays got longer, censorship was heavy, especially around WWI. This led to strikes, unrest.
But despite that control, did Latvians manage to, gain any ground, develop their own identity during this long period?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't completely suppressed, even though in the early 1800s, only maybe 10% of landowners were Latvian. As Latvia, particularly Riga, prospered within the empire, Riga became this incredibly fast-growing, wealthy city, hitting 400,000 people by the end of the century. Many Latvians moved to the cities, and this growing, educated urban class started establishing their own institutions from the 1860s onwards. Public, educational, progressive organizations formed. A movement specifically pushing to abolish the old privileges of the Baltic German barons gained real steam. And this is the era that gives rise to the National Awakening.
Right. This sounds pivotal. Tell us about the National Awakening.
It really was. Starts roughly early to late 19th century, fueled by that frustration with the lingering Baltic German power. And also, maybe paradoxically, influenced by Russia's own complex nationalities policies. Educated Latvians began to consciously focus on their native language, their rich folklore. A dedicated movement grew, studying Latvian history, collecting folk songs, stories, promoting the language. An independent Latvian middle class emerged, culturally separate from the dominant German-speaking one, and these national ideas spread from the cities back to the rural areas. Latvians developed this real sense of national pride, embracing their folk culture, peasant songs, ballets. Publishing houses printed works in Latvian, sometimes even things that were officially discouraged or outlawed. Despite Tsarist restrictions, Latvian remained the language of daily life for most.
And those song festivals you mentioned.
Yes. A key unifying element. Starting in 1864, these massive gatherings, thousands singing together, they forged this shared identity, this sense of nationhood that transcended politics. It even got international attention. But it wasn't just cultural. You also saw political developments, the rise of the Social Democratic Party, arguments between urban and rural interests. But this whole period of sort of burgeoning national feeling, it came to a pretty abrupt and violent end. First with the failed 1905 Russian Revolution, the crackdowns that followed, and then, of course, the catastrophe of World War I.
World War I, which reshaped everything.
Yeah.
How did that global conflict push Latvia towards independence?
Well, the sources describe the situation just before the Russian Revolution, during WWI, as chaos. Latvia was caught, German army advancing from the west, the Russian Empire collapsing in the east, going through its own revolution. The Social Democrats were important, but initially their policy wasn't strongly nationalist, more internationalist. But amidst all this chaos, the desire for self-determination just grew stronger. Late 1917, the Latvian National Council is founded. And they're explicit. Latvia is a nation. It requires self-determination. Russian sovereignty is temporary. They pushed hard for self-rule, even as the Russian provisional government tried to sidetrack them. Then, after the provisional government in Russia was ousted, the People's Council, that's the renamed National Assembly, they decided the moment had come. November 18th, 1918, they declared an independent Republic of Latvia.
Declaring independence.
Yeah.
But securing it must have been incredibly difficult in that environment.
Oh, absolutely. It led straight into the Latvian War of Independence. From 1918 to 1920, the sources use that term for the intense fighting. The new Latvian Republic, building its army from basically nothing, had to fight on multiple fronts. Against Bolshevik Russian troops trying to reclaim territory, against German forces, including the local Baltic German Landeswehr militia, and even against other anti-Bolshevik forces like General Yudench's troops.
Wow, a real fight for survival.
It really was. The sources emphasize the success of the Latvian forces in defending their sovereignty, pure determination, and some key victories. One battle often highlighted is at Cesis Castle, June 1919, against the Landesverv, seen as crucial for ensuring Latvia's future as an independent nation. The actual front lines of these conflicts swept back and forth across Latvia during those years. The war finally ended with peace treaties. The really important one was the Treaty of Peace with Soviet Russia, signed March 3, 1920. That hard-won struggle is what allowed the Latvian state, now recognized by Western powers, to appear firmly on the map. And just to underscore that international acceptance, Latvia joined the League of Nations on September 20, 1921.
So independence finally secured. What was this interwar period between the world wars like for the young Latvian Republic?
It was a time of really significant development, economic, political, but also quite turbulent internally, and always shattered by dependence on its powerful neighbors. The sources note Latvia was initially seen quite positively internationally. Joining the League of Nations quickly shows that. Politically, the groundwork had been laid earlier, serfdom abolished back in 1861, the National Awakening. Cultural institutions like the first Songfest, theater, established in the late 19th century. However, despite the democratic aims, the interwar period faced instability. And this ultimately led to an authoritarian regime taking over in the mid-1930s.
But culturally, you mentioned a flourishing earlier. Did that continue during independence?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The sources really emphasize this. After WWI, independence unleashed this cultural energy. Language, intellectual tradition, key factors during the awakening, now had freedom to really thrive. It cemented that national identity. In the first year alone, major institutions popped up. National Theater, National Museum of Art, National Opera, State Academic Choir. The song and dance festival tradition grew even bigger, became this massive national event, even got its own National Center of Culture. Universities drove national science. Theater, visual arts, the painter Wilhelms Pervidus is mentioned. Literature, like Rudolf Splamanis, they gained international recognition.
So projecting Latvian culture outward, too.
Exactly. Latvia participated in international exhibitions like Brussels in 1935, showcasing culture, industry, economy. Youth organizations were active, student self-governance. Radio broadcasting became official, another important national platform.
Well, you mentioned the political turbulence leading to an authoritarian regime. What happened there?
Right. Despite the cultural success, social issues were growing. And the sources mention issues like a lack of press freedom, self-censorship, even before the big shift. The key event noted is a military coup d'etat in 1934. The sources attribute it to things like counter-parliamentarism, basically, a backlash against the often messy multi-party democracy and a worsening political climate. This coup suspended democratic rights, and the source argues it destroyed much of the work done in building a democratic country, actually worsening the political and economic situation significantly.
So a period of cultural achievement and development, but politically fragile, ending in authoritarianism, just as Europe heads towards World War II. What was Latvia's experience then?
It was tragic. Caught between two absolutely brutal totalitarian regimes. First, the Soviet impact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. We know now it had secret protocols.
Assigning the Baltics to the Soviet sphere.
Precisely. So, June 16th, 1940. The Soviets issue an ultimatum, demand a government change, allow Soviet troops in. The next day, Latvia was invaded, occupied. It was swift. Total. Latvian officials replaced, pro-Soviet propaganda everywhere, references to sovereignty vanished, and then the deportations began. The sources highlight this horrific night, June 14th to 15, 1941. Tens of thousands rounded up, described as the Black Night of Latgale. NKVD, the secret police, forcing people onto trucks, taking property, shipping them off to Siberia or elsewhere.
It's just horrific. And then the Nazis arrived.
Yes. After the Soviets were pushed back during the initial German invasion of the USSR, German units occupied Latvia in the latter half of 1941. Initially, there might have been some cautious welcome simply because they drove out the NKVD, but that didn't last. The Nazi occupation quickly proved devastatingly brutal in its own way. Cultural life, the sources say, was subjected to re-education in the spirit of National Socialism. Actively trying to erase recent Latvian achievements, anti-Latvian actions started immediately. Many professionals fled if they could, but many others suffered terribly. The sources mention executions, torture of Jews, and also Latvians who tried to help them, and the war itself caused massive destruction. Infrastructure, cultural sites like parts of the University of Riga, libraries, archives, all damaged or destroyed.
And after the Nazi defeat in 1945, Soviet control returned.
Yes. Almost instantly after Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Soviets reestablished full control. The source mentions local newspapers at the time reflecting this deep uncertainty about the future. But Soviet power returned, and it stayed for 50 years. The struggle for Latvian identity continued under intense pressure, especially considering by 1959, ethnic Latvians were only about half the population due to deliberate Soviet settlement policies. The sources characterize those decades by Russification, pushing Russian language and culture, encouraging intermarriage, assimilation, though Soviet Latvia remained economically important to Moscow.
So decades under Soviet rule, after the horrors of WWII, how did Latvia finally break free and regain independence?
Well, active steps really began in the late 1980s. Things were changing in the Soviet Union itself under Gorbachev. Starting around 87, the Latvian National Awakening movement began organizing these mass gatherings, demonstrations. And the cultural figures, the intelligentsia, just like in the 19th century, played a huge role again. Using their platforms, the sources mention a significant 1975 concert, as an example, expressing national feeling in ways that maybe weren't overtly political, but clearly challenged the system, kept identity alive. This whole period with the mass peaceful gatherings, the use of song as protest, it's often called the singing revolution.
Right. A powerful image.
And then came that incredible moment in 1989, the Baltic Way. This human chain, 340 miles long, stretching across Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, millions of people, peacefully protesting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and demanding freedom. It got huge international attention.
A massive statement.
It really was.
Yeah.
And responding to this pressure and the changes in Moscow, the Latvian Supreme Soviet started the process in March 1990, adopted resolutions to begin restoring independence. Then, May 4th, 1990, came the Act of the Restoration of the Republic of Latvia. This declared all the Soviet decisions after June 16, 1940, invalid. Statehood was being restored based on the legal continuity of the pre-1940 republic.
So that's the declaration, but when did it become, fully real and recognized?
That declaration wasn't immediately accepted by Moscow. The crucial moment came after the failed hardliner coup in Moscow in August 1991. In the chaos following that, Latvia declared de jure legal independence again on August 21, 1991. A constitutional act confirming the restoration based on the pre-1940 state was adopted in July 1992. Democratic elections for the new parliament had actually happened back in June 1990, even before full independence was secured. And a really key step was getting Russian troops out. That was completed in 1993 with the last bits of equipment dismantled in 94. This whole process really positioned Latvia as a leader among the ex-Soviet states, aiming for full integration with the West, NATO, and the EU.
Latvia independent again. What has that nation-building process looked like since the 90s? It must have been complex.
Oh, incredibly complex. The sources describe it as a profound, rapid transformation. Politically, moving to a democratic republic, multi-party system. Economically, the huge shift to a market economy. And Latvia took a very radical reform path in the 90s, one of the boldest in Central and Eastern Europe.
How did that play out economically?
In phases, really. Early 90s, 91 to 95, was all about post-Soviet restructuring, creating private businesses. Then came a period of growth, driven a lot by transit trade, huge revenues there. But then challenges hit. People leaving for work abroad, labor resource export, a big banking crisis in 1995. And the 2009 global financial crisis hit Latvia incredibly hard, led to a lack of resources, really harsh austerity measures to balance the budget. The sources suggest Latvia is still kind of defining its long-term development path. Joining the EU in 2004 helped close gaps, but also raised questions about economic sustainability.
And the political side, you mentioned multi-party.
Yes, a parliamentary democracy, president elected by parliament. The early 90s were politically wild. Hundreds of parties formed initially, so forming stable majority governments is still a challenge. Often needs coalitions of at least 4 different party groups to ensure representation.
And the people. You mentioned demographic changes earlier. What's the picture now? Social challenges.
Demographics are a really key, complex issue. Population was around 2.3 million in 2004, and the sources said it was declining. Low birth rate, emigration, both ethnic Latvians and non-nationals from the Soviet era leaving, and high mortality rates, especially for men.
And the ethnic mix.
In 2004, it was about 58% Latvians, 29% Russians, plus Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, others. A major social challenge mentioned is language. In 2000, only about 59% could manage basic functions in Latvian. That points to integration issues, health stats, life expectancy, lower than nearby Western countries. And the sources point out Latvia had the biggest income inequality gap in the EU at that time. High rates of depression, alcohol abuse, suicide, especially among men. So yeah, social inequalities, fully integrating the large Russian-speaking minority, These remain really significant ongoing challenges for modern Latvia.
Right. A clear picture of the complexity still being worked through. It's truly remarkable, though, how despite all that centuries of foreign rule, war, hardship, Latvian cultural identity just endured. What are the key pillars of that heritage, according to the sources?
Language has to be number one. Latvian is ancient, Indo-European, one of Europe's oldest surviving languages. Its unique sounds can make it tricky to learn, apparently, but it's been this incredibly strong unifying force, especially considering all the attempts by occupiers to suppress it, even banning the Latin script sometimes.
What do we see written down?
First written examples are 16th century. Later figures like Garlieb Merkel were key in shaping the modern language. There's a rich literary tradition. The sources mention a revival of Latgalian literature too, and this strong commitment to preserving orthography. Even clandestine literature circulated during Soviet times, and a recent push to retranslate major works into contemporary Latvian. And folk culture, expressed in the language, is still incredibly rich. Humor often tied to very specific, unique metaphors.
Beyond language.
Traditional arts and crafts, passed down through generations. Weaving, especially those colorful woolen socks and mittens that dates back to pre-Christian times. Strong traditions in pottery, straw weaving, wooden house building, woodworking. Artists today often draw inspiration from this folk art. It's seen as simple, genuine, reflecting national character, wisdom, thrift. The sources give examples. The Jurmala Church in Kladiga, a huge wooden sacral building, and Bauska Castle, unique for showing all stages of fortified dwelling development.
And festivals.
Yeah.
They seem crucial.
Absolutely vital expressions of heritage. They connect people to life cycles, seasons, opportunities for folk traditions, community interaction. Things like harvest festivals, solstices, January's huge wedding customs. Public festivals mix religious, state, and folk events. Christmas blends pagan and Christian traditions. New Year has masquerades, symbolizing the old and new sun. And of course, the Song and Dance Festival. It just stands out. Started in 1874, grew into this massive cultural event. Thousands of singers, dancers. It signifies the strength of the choir movement, folk singing. It's a powerful symbol of unity that even occupations couldn't entirely stamp out.
We've covered so much history, culture, identity. If someone listening wants to connect with this past more tangibly, are there specific historical sites the sources point to?
Oh, definitely. Latvia has many places that really breathe history. Riga Old Town, for starters. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site for a reason. Just walking around, the architecture tells a story. Gothic, Baroque, Romanesque, and that amazing Art Nouveau layer. It speaks of the city founded in 1201, shaped by all those different powers, key sites. The Dome Cathedral started 1211, now Lutheran Church and Concert Hall. St. Peter's Church with its famous tall tower. The Three Brothers, the oldest dwelling complex, 15th century. Parts of the old city wall, the Powder Tower housing a war museum exhibit. The House of Blackheads, that historic guild house. The Roland statue symbolizing independence. The neoclassical former stock exchange. The quirky House of Cats. Swedish Gate, the art museum. It's just packed a visual timeline.
Sounds incredible. Anywhere else particularly significant?
Cesis Castle, right in the heart of Latvia in Vidzemi. Built by the Livonian Order, 13th century. Major defense fortress, power base. Saw lots of reconstruction, fortification over time. But its real resonance today, it's the site of that crucial Battle of Cesis in 1919. During the War of Independence, the battle, the sources say, basically secured Latvia's existence as an independent nation. You can really feel the weight of that history there.
Wow, okay.
And down south, there's Bauska Castle, located where two rivers meet. It's unique because you have ruins of a late 15th century Livonian Order castle and a later Renaissance castle complex from the early 16th century, fortified, expanded by the Duke of Courland, but destroyed by Russian forces during the Great Northern War. Now it's a national monument, archaeological site. But what makes it stand out, according to the source, is how it preserves evidence of all stages of fortified dwelling development, from medieval right through to early modern.
So, stepping back from all these details, this whole deep dive, what's the big takeaway about Latvia's history?
Well, it's undeniably a history shaped by immense external forces, hasn't it? Centuries of invasions, occupations, German orders, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, Russia. Then the devastating 20th century with the dual occupations. It's a story marked by war, political struggle, major demographic shifts.
Yet, running through all that turbulence, there's this incredibly persistent thread of resilience. The sources really drive home how, despite deliberate attempts to crush Latvian language, culture, identity, It survived. It was actively nurtured through traditions, institutions, movements like the National Awakening, the Singing Revolution.
Exactly. They navigated these incredibly complex geopolitical currents, pulled west by the Hanseatic League, enduring centuries under Eastern empires, then finally achieving independence, integrating with the EU and NATO in the modern era.
It really shows how those things that seem intangible, language, folk songs, shared stories, that sense of history, how powerful they can be, vital forces against overwhelming pressure.
Right. They constantly shaped the social climate, political behavior, influenced demographics, the economy, right up to today. Honestly, the story of Latvia's survival, preserving its identity, restoring statehood against those odds, it's pretty remarkable when you lay it all out. Which leaves us, and you listening, with something to think about, perhaps. Given these deep historical layers, the ancient land, the tribes, centuries of foreign rule, the cultural endurance, the 20th century trauma, the rapid modern changes, how do these experiences continue to shape the choices, the identity, the perspective of Latvia and its people today? How do they see their place in the world now?
Definitely a lot to reflect on there. We hope you found this deep dive insightful. Thanks for listening.